Welcome back. Svihlik and Shooter back at it on the War Room, powered by Draft HQ and Prep Baseball. DJ, what an absolute episode with Jim Callis, the legendary mock draft king. It was very fascinating hearing his insight into what has transpired over his last how many years.
Yeah, I keep calling him the Mel Kiper of baseball. The guy, I've known Jim a long time. He's a super guy. He's obviously very passionate, super well informed, and super well respected. People really like he's respectful of people's opinions. Like he said on the show, I've engaged with him in my previous role. He never lets stuff out. You can trust him. It was absolutely fantastic. We could have probably gone on for 3 hours if we would have just let him keep rolling. His recall's fabulous.
Absolutely. Fabulous. What I love is it is so important for the industry. And I mean, baseball writers probably more legendary than anything else or any other writers in the sports sphere, but it's so important to the game to promote the sport, right? As people keep saying, baseball's getting slow, whatever it may be. No, it's outstanding. And writers like that really help it. Kendall Rogers, Aaron Fitt, the guys at D1 Baseball do a great job from the college standpoint. Mm-hmm. It was really fascinating. I know you and I were just talking about the differences and how each of our companies go about putting our boards together and our mock drafts. What did you have to say about that?
Yeah, there's not, and this is what I would say. As long as you have a strategy for scouts, for teams, we talked about this with draft boards, like that's what you're looking for. You're looking for people that have structure and goals and strategy and what are they trying to accomplish? It doesn't matter that one group is trying to accomplish A and the other group is trying to accomplish B. It was clear. He made it crystal clear in our discussion. His goal is to put the players on their mock, how they're going to come off the board. How they're going to come. Along the way, he has his personal opinions. He tweaks his lists. He's listening to third party. He's got great relationships in the game. So you can see where he likes the players. But make no mistake, it sounded very clear to me that he wants his mocks to reflect how the players are going to come off the board. And that's not necessarily the case. That's not our goal at Prep Baseball.
Not at all. It's ours is more for that big board stand where we're holding the industry to a I don't want to say standard, but like this is where we're at. These are the evaluations where we have guys. Some teams will draft above us, some will be below us, but we're essentially, like you were saying, kind of going in as the 31st team. This is where we will be. And I think it's tough for us, not too tough, but like the buzz, the whispers, the smoke screens. Well, if we have a confident evaluation, this is where we are. And I think we do a great job with that and producing our big board. Obviously, some players, we're going to talk about Charlie Condon in the future, who have really outpaced the industry in that sense. But very fascinating stuff. I'm having Jim Callis on. I might have to have him on again in the future. But today, DJ, I am ultra fascinated. We have a great guest coming on, Jay Harrison, a little bit. Makeup assessments. And we have all the data here at Prep Baseball, which is outstanding. Sean Duncan and the entire company have done such a great job, whether it's the S2 cognition, the TrackMan, blast motion, all the data points that we've come to. We have all those great data points, but what about makeup assessment, that competitive drive? How do we assess that?
Yeah, Shooter, it's a fascinating topic to me. And a lot of people want to make it really subjective. But I think with time, what we found is that makeup can be just as objective if we allow it to be. And that's a very key point. If we allow it to be, we need to make a very concerted effort as an industry. If you're as an organization, define it, what it is, and try to really understand where it's important, how we're going to go about assessing it. Here's an interesting story. We would interview scouts, and we would interview young scouts and veteran scouts. And I would always ask a similar question. Paul Phillips talked about the different buckets that you look at when you're assessing a player. And one of my interview questions, for nothing more than a conversation point, was, we know that physical tools and abilities are important. We know that skill sets are important. We know that analytics and data are important. We know that competitive makeup is important. We know that athleticism is important. So we got these 5 or 6 buckets, 5 buckets. Put them in order and tell me the ones that are the most important to you at this point in your career. And it was amazing. I didn't know this the first time we did it, but as we kept asking that question of different people, What we found was the most veteran, experienced scouts that have a lot of scar tissue. They've made good decisions and they've made some bad decisions. It was always fascinating to me where they would rank competitive makeup in that spectrum. It was really, really high. And you can guess what the young scouts did. They leaned right into data and they leaned into information and those kind of things. So it's just an observation that I had over the last few years about how different types of scouts perceive competitive makeup.
Just tying into your, like, those buckets. What were certain buckets that you guys were putting stock into?
So historically, and I'm going to throw out some very typical words that you hear when you hear competitive makeup. You hear things like competitiveness.
Mm-hmm.
You hear things like work ethic. You hear things like the ability to overcome adversity. You hear tenacity. You hear grit. Angela Duckworth uses the word grit. It's the number one. She's written all those books on those kind of things.
Oh, yeah.
So you hear these very hot button words, but what is difficult is how do you define them? How do you define them? How do you measure them? How do you weight them? How do you know how important they are to different parts of the evaluation? At the end, you hear things like, he just didn't have it. 4, 5, 6 years, he didn't get it. He didn't, and that's real convenient for player development. I don't want to get on my soapbox here, but it's really convenient for somebody. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think you talked about how do they deal with adversity. I think of pitchers and the old-time scouting, right? Want to see him have some runners on. Deal with something. I'm thinking recency bias of a pitcher I just saw who cruised through 5 innings and then, got into some hiccups. Hey, how's he going to deal with this?
Mm-hmm.
He's tired.
Yep.
He's on the road. This is a big game. Now, this particular kid did a great job, managed the situation. It's a reason why he's going to be really good. But to the same extent, and I'll kind of shift gears into more of my focus when I'm going out. Right? Who's that Fugazi? Who's that fake tough guy? Who's the guy that's stepping in the box and staring at his barrel and giving his deep breath and readjusting his gloves because somebody told him what to do? Versus who's the kid who can brush off that bat at bat, goes out to the field, makes a play, doesn't have to do all the showmanship of that. Kind of some stuff that who doesn't have a crutch? Does he need a crutch? Does he need to do his crossover symmetry, his bands, his J bands, his balls? Or can he just, bang out a couple push-ups, hop on the bump, throw 10 pitches, and then he's ready to roll? Those are kind of some things that I look for. And talking to our young scouts internally, hey, get there early, yes. What's eyewash and what's not? And I think sometimes, and you said those data-driven guys, the younger scouts who are coming in, we have an amazing age of baseball where it's not just ex-players. It's, we have all different sorts of guys going in. But that evaluation period of a person who's been around the game, like, that's not real. What he's doing there, I don't know what that pull is that he's utilizing for his hips right now, but it's too much. Do less, buddy.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to what you just discussed there. I think it's what's very difficult when it comes to makeup, and I'm not avoiding your question. What's very difficult when it comes to makeup is that the player's doing things when you're not there. So we sometimes have to just pay attention to the obvious. We have to pay attention to the obvious, and we have to accept the fact that 80% of the players, and I'm throwing this number out there, 80% of the players fall in the middle range of this spectrum. Maybe it's 85%. Because when you're pitching at Tulane on Friday night, or you're pitching at Vanderbilt, or you're pitching at UCLA, or you're the number 3 hitter for 2 years in a row at the University of Georgia, I'm just going to call a spade a spade. You're probably wired right. But what we're looking for are outliers. So when you as a young scout, any scout, veteran scout, young scout, when you go in and see a player, you have to be aware that you're only seeing that player for a couple hours of the vast amount of hours where he's going to play and do things over the course of that year. And you don't know what's going on in his personal life. You don't know necessarily how he's feeling on that particular day. So it's really hard to put that stock into that one moment. It really is. So you spend a lot of time teaching scouts, talking to scouts about the right questions to ask the people that are around the player a lot. So again, I'm not avoiding your question. Sure, when you're at the ballpark, can you watch a player step up in a big moment? Can you watch a player perform in a really adverse situation? Yeah, but that doesn't define necessarily who he is as a player or as a person. So you've got to really peel back the layer and spend time and invest time asking good questions of the people that are around that player a lot, and then making good decisions. And you can't ask leading questions. You have to have good, solid, strong questions to help you understand that player, because you're not going to be around him a lot, and you're not going to see him play 65 games over the course of a college season or high school season.
Can you overassess? Because I'm thinking more high end, right? You are making huge decisions, huge 7-figure decisions, probably some agents that were hoping for 10-figure or 8-figure decisions. Right. Is there too much at times where like I've nitpicked at this guy so much that we just missed out on an opportunity?
Let me change your word. You said overassess. I'm going to say overthink.
There you go.
I'm going to say overthink. Are we putting
paralysis by analysis?
Sure. And it's the care level of the scout. It's this care level of the evaluator. It comes from a good place. The problem is that we might put stock into things that don't matter. Let me share an example for you. In 2007, I might get my years wrong. In 2007, I sat at a scout day at a major SEC. I'll never forget this. I sat at a scout day and I listened to scouts behind me who, to this very, very day, I respect the hell out of. These were, in a way, mentors for me, I guess you'd say. These are scouts that I leaned on. These are scouts that I knew as a young area scout. And I was very open-minded, and I wanted to listen and I wanted to learn. And I heard them bury a player that had been drafted the year before. Not because he's a turd off the field or any of that kind of stuff. They banged on his work ethic and preparation and care level for the game. And I turned around and I said, really? I said, I don't understand what you're saying. I remember this like it was yesterday. That I could tell you that player is now $100 million into his big league career. So how we perceive what that player is showing us on the field is really, really important. Perhaps they didn't ask the right questions of the coach. Perhaps they put too much stock into what that coach said. And they weren't just keeping it simple. That player performed in big moments all the time, and the coach continually gave him the ball. So what was the coach really telling you? He's the guy. No, he wasn't the best. He probably didn't work like you worked, Shooter. He probably didn't care like you cared, but he knew himself as a player, and he was able to go on and have a great career.
It's fascinating the biases that I see in myself from my playing days that I carry over into the evaluations. And I would think, a fair amount of scouts. I mean, what's those who can't play coach, or the old adage of that, like the intensity that I would bring that didn't work for me I don't need to impart that on my evaluation. Hey, this guy competes differently. We're going to talk with Jay about a lot of that, but like, how does he compete? It's a different way than I do it. I'm sweating blood on the field, but like not playing in the big leagues. There's a lot of guys who I perceive as lazy. Like, does this guy compete? No, but go ahead.
Coaches are not incentivized to tell you the truth. They're not. They're going to protect their programs and they're going to protect their players. It's not because they're bad people. That's just what coaches do. So they present a hurdle there. They present a roadblock. So if you're the lead decision maker, Shooter Hunt or DJ or whoever it is the lead decision maker, you can't expect to get it from them. And then you're going to expect to get it from who? Your young area scout who lacks expertise. You're going to get it from somebody that might lack commitment. There's some really, really good scouts that do not commit to understanding who that player is. Why? Because they understand they're not an expert. They understand how hard it is, and they got all these other things to do in their job that's really, really important. So you're going to lean on them? They're going to walk into a room and you're going to ask them, talk to me about the competitive makeup of the player. And you're going to make a $1 million decision based on that. Or maybe it's just confirmation bias. The young scout, even the veteran scout knows he likes the talent of the player, and he knows what it means if he says, yeah, this guy's just average. Whereas a scouting director, I would say, yeah, that's fine, because most of them are average. You're an average attorney. You're an average engineer. You're an average financial advisor. You're an average makeup baseball player. That's just kind of what it is. We're looking for the outliers. But what you hear in draft rooms all the time, you get good talent, all of a sudden the makeup's fantastic. Scouts do that all the time. So scouts provide a major roadblock to really truly understanding these players. So when you're the decision maker, what do? What expert do you lean into? What resources do you utilize to get the real understanding? Because all you want to do is have comfort in the selection. In a really uncomfortable space, you want to have comfort that the player that you're getting, you have confidence that he will be able to maximize whatever potential he has, whether it's the first round or you're selecting a player in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 15th round. Does that player have the things necessary to maximize whatever potential he has?
Now we talked about having all those data points. Do teams assess behavior well? And are certain teams better at it? Do some teams not give any care to it?
I'm certain teams don't care.
Mm.
That's
Wow.
you know what? That's not a slight or a criticism of that team. I don't necessarily have an opinion of that. That's not my speed. I think it matters personally. But if a team, the worst thing you can do is go like half foot in, half foot out. That's the worst, because now you're going to make decisions on both sides of the aisle that can be highly detrimental. At the very least, some teams go, we'll just take the physical talent. And that's fine, because they don't want to overthink it. And they don't want to necessarily invest the time and the energy into figuring out something in this real gray world. Whereas I look at it and I say, no, we see players all the time move through their minor league career, and then we hear the same thing at the end. He didn't have it. It didn't matter enough to him. We hear these subjective words that people can't really explain because they're not experts. They just generally lob it out there. Well, is that a coach lobbing out there, an organization lobbing out there because they didn't instruct the player, because they didn't develop the player the way he needed to be developed? So I see this as a marriage between scouting, like we've talked about on previous episodes. There needs to be a marriage between player development and scouting, so that Shooter Hunt and DJ Svihlik and CJ Abrams and Charlie Condon and Anthony Volpe, we're all different people. And we need to be developed differently. That's where I see the real marriage happening that doesn't necessarily happen. So players get labeled and pigeonholed, and the opinions are formed of them early, and sometimes development plans can go awry because of it. So I find it to be very, very important that we know who these players are, that JP Morgan's knows who they know who the people are that they're bringing in their organization. Google knows the people that fit their culture. Why aren't we doing it more in professional baseball?
Well, great point there. I think it's going to lead into an excellent discussion with Jay Harrison. Plus, you and I are eventually in the future going to talk about some pre-draft interviews and the processes of teams. We now welcome on a special guest, Jay Harrison, PhD, performance psychology.
Hey, Jay, how you doing today?
Fantastic, DJ. How are you? Shooter, nice to see you.
I'm good. It's great to see you again, and thanks a lot for joining the show, taking the time with us today. I look at your career and I think Toronto, Canada. I think 9-year NHL career with your hometown Leafs, the Hurricanes, the Jets. Then we go on to masters in clinical psychology. Then we continue on to PhD in performance psychology. This has got to be one of the most fascinating careers paths that I've ever seen from someone that has such an elite background like yourself. To talk to me about this personal journey and how it manifested itself in this career that we have right now.
Yeah, well, I guess if you knew me as a player, the journey would have been quite obvious. Classic overthinker. No, I had a unique path to play professional hockey and to reach the highest level in the NHL. It wasn't a linear path. I didn't get there. It didn't come easy. So I found myself oftentimes looking for uh, other parts of myself to develop, and a lot of times, whether that was buffering against the stress or the career insecurity, or even just looking to find new meaning and new purpose in other things. And for me, I had a lot of great mentors and was naturally, drawn towards the academic field. So academics just came natural to me. It just fit that I like to learn. I enjoyed to write. I enjoyed asking the questions why, which all fit into someone who would naturally like to learn about psychology. But one of the unique things I found through that journey was that not only was that adding to this other aspect of my life, it was actually enhancing my performance as an athlete as well.
Hmm.
And I was like, now this is really interesting considering some of the things we're learning here. So I wanted to better understand this. And I also saw a gap as I played. And, I joke about, who I was as a player and some of the challenges I dealt with, but really felt that there was a gap in holistically understanding, connecting, and ultimately servicing the athlete, especially at the elite level, with so much that we think we know about pro sports, we think we know about professional athletes, that we assume about their lives. It's no different than seeing Spider-Man fly around and imagining he just has the greatest life, right? But he does go home and be Peter Parker and deals with Peter Parker stuff. So I wanted to put myself in a position where I could be on the front lines, where I could meaningfully contribute to the experiences of athletes, realizing their full potential in sport, beyond sport, and then also contributing to the understanding of how we really conceptualize this world, of athlete development, career transition, performance. So how is the relationship, tying it back to my experience? How does that manifest? How do we support and enhance athletes' potential without negating their long-term development, and how do we communicate that, demonstrate it, and ultimately communicate it in a way that generates buy-in, where you're not just telling athletes, this career may be over for you one day, or you're eventually going to have to transition, which we now know has the opposite effect of what you would like it to do. That just further reinforces why I better not be thinking about anything else. But actually recognizing that holistically developing yourself enhances your ability to be an athlete in the present. It's all part of plan A. So that's really been my journey, and I like to learn, and I get humbled every day. I realize what I don't know
Sure.
every day. If you want to be in psychology will do that to you. You'll be humbled by what you don't know every day. So I continue to do my work in sports primarily. I have a practice around sport, around mental health, performance, but I also do some executive work as well, which allows me to walk in multiple different worlds and learn from different experiences where the consistencies across performance and well-being exist, and how to enhance and help people realize that.
Now, so you were doing some of this while playing, you found some interest in it? Because I think back to my experience, and I even tell guys now, they get drafted and they say, what can you do? I said, find a hobby, find something else to do. Like I was playing baseball and that's all I like to do. I could never get away from things. I wasn't a golfer. And honestly, the parents were like, don't play video games. I'm like, hey, if he wants to be a good minor league baseball player, he should go take up Fortnite, because you'll play 6 hours of it before going to the field. So what was getting away to do this and kind of study, was that something that helped you during your career? And then you're like, hey, I'm enjoying this even more, and the richness of enjoying learning going beyond from there.
Yeah, I attribute a lot of it to, I mean, not just like this foresight of, having all this to do. It was actually, a lot of it was responsive to, the identity threat, and the challenges of a career and finding new meaning to cope with some of the anxieties that go
Mhm.
with being a minor league player for a long period of time. But, when it came to academics, I was like Alex Bregman in the cage. I was obsessed and couldn't get me out of there. It'd be midnight and I'd still be doing it, even if it wasn't for my own good at the time. It was what I became incredibly passionate about. I ended up, the more I did, it seemed the better I played. That was the unique connection that I made. So, like, I mean, as a professional
Wow.
athlete, I think total. I mean, I did almost my entire undergrad, half of my master's degree, like, as a professional athlete.
No
And
way.
yeah, it was, and it's something that I felt I didn't have to take away from anything. It was actually fulfilling and pulling in all directions, because as I went on to show, athletes who do more things outside of their sport actually function better psychologically, right? It started with some research out of Australia, where we were seeing, athletes who do things in what we call career engagement, right? Things relative to their post-career vocational development actually perform better in union rugby. We're seeing they get selected more, they make more money, they get hurt less. So that research came out of Australia, and I certainly built on that. And I wanted to demonstrate in a North American context, what's the relationship for professional athletes in North America on their engagement with career development like activities, and how does that relate to their athletic identity and their well-being? Sure enough, we saw the more engaged you were outside of your sport, the better off generally you did from a mental health perspective or a mental well-being perspective. So it largely validated a lot of the what we would call that like psychological capital you're able to accrue through things like an education or a hobby or just another aspect of cultivating yourself. It allows you to buffer against the stresses of the professional sports environment, which used to always say going into training camp, like, I don't care if it's the best season you've ever had. There are going to be valleys in this season that are going to be terrible, that you're going to wish you were never here. So what do you have in those times that you largely are out of your control, right? So we look at it in that respect, that the more psychological capital you have, the more self-efficacy you have, the greater you are able to buffer those ultimate setbacks within sport and allow you to get back to your most optimal self quickly.
That's incredible. Like the idea that you were taking a test on Freud before playing the Rangers at the Garden was probably something that you were thinking about. I always thought, hey, if I could just go play hoops and go play basketball until I had to start warming up, that would have made me a much better player. Now, I didn't have a degree in this, so I didn't think that it was something that was spot on. But so many coaches are always, go out, you got to practice this 10-hour set. And what you're saying here is just spot on for me. It's hitting a nerve for me where, hey, you do need to give your brain a break from what's going on to optimize what you're going to do. Is that right?
Yeah, it does. And it comes in a lot of ways. It's not that the message is like, well, you have to be, focused on something like this. Like, I started to hear stories of players doing like a number of things. A guy starts his own wine label. A guy starts a longboarding company. We have players like I see now in the NHL. These guys are doing private equity deals on game day, right? There's a lot of different things that you can do that get you interested and excited, and like I say, add to that degree of like self-determination, right? That sense of having something that the game can't take away, right? That really helps you buffer the stress and play a little freer, a little looser. So for me, like whether, hockey, it was +4 or -4, that's, I guess the equivalent of going 4 for 4 or 0 for 4, or maybe -4 in hockey would be like 0 for 10 over the weekend or something. But I had something to revert back to that gave me a sense of purpose, connectedness, and a sense of hope and optimism for my future. And that translated into all aspects of my life. So when I work with my athletes that I have today, we often talk about not taking the game home with you. I often flip that and say, well, what are you taking with you to the game to enhance and be your best player today, whether that's the field or the rink, right? We're often trying to mitigate the negative impact of the game on the rest of our lives. We never tend to focus on how the rest of our lives can positively impact the game.
I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing helping the athlete, the development side, and the assessing side, which you and I have talked a lot about. It sounds to me like a lot of your work started on the understanding the athlete and then developing the athlete, the care for the athlete. And now there's a lot of like assessing the athlete and trying to understand and scale and measure where they are on this spectrum of competitive makeup. Have you changed over time? Do you view the athlete differently now than you did when you were just a player? The
Yes.
more you've studied the athlete, the more you've interacted with them, do you see them a little bit different? Do you assess them differently?
Yeah, I see it very differently. And I think that's just the nature of the lens I have from being a player to now observing a player. And it's, now looking at the broader continuum of the athlete's life and seeing athletes through multiple different lenses. You really do see a very different athlete, and not nearly one as invincible as they like to see themselves or how we may have once thought ourselves as. So you mentioned a big part of what I do in my practice with my clients, whether they're athletes or executives. I do a lot of behavioral analysis to help, fully understand the individual. And it feeds to the two things that you talked about, the individual development and then assessing and aligning, right? And it really all feeds this understanding of the individual. So come to the realization with some, very incredible mentors that, success manifests in a lot of different ways depending on what environment you're in. and that how we're naturally wired behaviorally has a huge impact in determining our viability in any given environment. I mean, we're all capable of doing anything and beating the odds. People win the lottery every day. But generally speaking, those who are high performers in given environments tend to share a behavioral signature. They're not exactly the same people. They're vastly different, but we tend to see them oriented in specific ways that allows them to navigate and ultimately manage their environment in a more effective way. So that is
Okay.
a really helpful tool that I use to help, one, understand my client, and then two, assess where the potential challenges might be with the relative environment that they're in. If there are some, inconsistencies there, how we might be able to resolve or at least come to an understanding and awareness to embrace them more fully.
I think that's a really important point that I want to get to in a second, the environment. So you say environment, and my mind immediately goes to, do you understand what your player in baseball, of course, or it could be in hockey, but specifically here in baseball, do you understand what your player development is all about? Do they understand the players? That environment that you're putting the player in to best realize his potential is really, really important. And I absolutely want to get there because I think it is the next level of behavioral analysis and all these kind of things. From a competitive makeup standpoint, from a behavior standpoint, if I said to you competitive makeup, what does that mean to you through your lens?
Well, competitive makeup there's a few core components to me, generally speaking. When we see success that transcend, fields and industries, we tend to see highly successful people are we call it, for lack of a better, they pursue competitive challenges, right? Or they're very achievement-seeking people in that they're highly ambitious and they're highly oriented towards one-on-one competition. Right. And that's just not a sports thing. They just generally like the idea of extrinsically winning. Right. And they're largely drawn to a high degree of devotion to be successful. Right. Their self-concept is very suited and they're willing to make a great deal of sacrifices to achieve that ambition, much of which is consistent with their self-concept. Whereas you may see, the adverse or inverse to that may be someone who has fear of success or unwilling to make the sacrifices associated to be successful. And that can manifest in hundreds of different ways based on who you're talking to and why. But generally, we tend to see the competitive mindset is driven by a very strong ambition to be great, not just good, not just get there, but to be the greatest who's done it. It seems to be a table stakes motivational orientation.
Let me stop you right there. Because I have a. How do you measure that? That's my biggest issue. We go out. I've worked in scouting my whole life. We know that this stuff is really, really important. We ask young scouts to do this. This is in their job description. Get to know Jay Harrison, get to know DJ, get to know Shooter, and then come back and tell me if he has those things. Yeah. So they speak in these very broad terms, and they'll say, "Oh, he's very competitive." And then you'll ask for some example and they'll give you something very abstract and you'll go, okay, great. He's competitive. And we generally know that if a player makes it to the Division I level, Shooter played at Tulane, I played at Illinois. If a player makes it to minor league hockey, he already has a base level of work ethic and competitiveness. But how then do we extract the unique players? Because they're all generally competitive once they make it to that level. They wouldn't have made it there if they didn't know how to work at all, or they didn't compete a little bit, or they weren't resilient and all these kind of things. But how then, once we have this group of good, pretty relative to the rest of us, good competitive players, good competitive makeup, how do we extract the outliers? Because it's hard for me to understand how a scout's going to do that.
Yeah, it becomes one of the challenges, right? That, I think we've talked before, and one of the challenges that exists generally in the talent assessment business is signals and static, right? And hearing a signal in static usually is what happens, not the confirmation bias. And that exists at all levels of evaluation, even psychology. Projective analysis can be incredibly difficult in its incredibly poor reliability. For me, it's understanding, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily matter what exactly it is, but that we can measure what we say we're measuring consistently, and it reflects the behavior that we've all agreed is important to get the outcomes we're going for. So competitive outcome may look very, very different in your organization than mine, which may look very, very different at Google. But it does matter how we're measuring it, how consistent we're relatively measuring it to each other, and then how well we can demonstrate its predictive value to actually distinguishing the highest performers from the rest, right? So we also actually need to put it into play, right?
Now are
So
those
not just go on, Shooter.
all those high performers? And what I love about you is that you have a hockey background, so the biases of DJ and I within the baseball world growing up, which is why I'm always fascinated by physical trainers or people who are not stuck in baseball, because we grew up thinking, hey, first and second, we're bunting here, whatever it may have been early on. But from what you've seen, you've talked about business guys, obviously you've dealt in hockey or in baseball here. Are all the high level performers and thinkers, are they all kind of on the same level where if we just put them blank on a page, not with sport, not with business, industry, whatever they are, would we see them the same? Or do you see them the same outside of their sport?
Oh, like, I mean, the relative performance strategies and strategies for sustained performance look vastly different. So that would be like, putting two animals, one from the desert and one from the jungle together, and looking and saying they have two very similar resilience strategies. Well, no, one retains water really well and one, does really well in wet environments, right? So I'm always mindful of that what is successful within a given environment is critically important, and recognizing, that competitive makeup may look or manifest very differently to be effective and adaptive in a given environment. Like, for example, the one I use all the time, like people talk about resilience or, determination, persistence, right? Well, how that manifests in an environment, like having determination and passion and things like that is sure the table stakes, but how does that actually manifest to produce results in a CEO, setting, being incredibly open to agility and adaptive radical change is a resilience strategy. And it can be farther from the truth in sports, where it is stay, persist, don't move, don't change, just continue, endure, endure, endure. Two resilient strategies, both incredibly effective, but you change the environments for each and they're going to stand out, equivalent to a camel in the jungle. So that's part of what we really want to understand, is understand the environment and what lends it to a success, and then really operationalize it and create a way that we can measure and understand to say that's what we're all talking about. Because that was one of the things that kind of drew me into this conversation around scouts. And I was a player, and make me take off my shirt and jump over a stick 40 times in 40 seconds in a draft room and not say anything and do anything you want me to do as a player. I get that as a player. Would you take a pill to win the World Series and then die in 5 years? And you say yes, and they're looking at you and they're like, you would? And then you say, no, I wouldn't do it. And you're like, you wouldn't? Right? And you're like, you don't know whether to, you don't know what to do in that situation. So I've always wanted to, fight for the player who gets written off because they don't necessarily fit into an archetype or satisfy someone's confirmation bias. So part of that is giving players language to understand who they are, how that might be different for their environment, and then the opportunity to empower them to actually talk about being an active participant in their own development environment.
Can I follow that up with, is there anything unique to specifically baseball players that you've seen and follow, where these successful baseball players different than hockey, basketball, Google business? What are the top baseball guys that you're kind of looking for?
So it's actually like really boring. So we look at a ton of behaviors. We look at 85 distinct non-correlated behaviors, and we also have to tie this to outcomes, right? So we're still relatively new at this, but we tend to see the things you would expect to see just even farther to the extreme on the spectrum, or the continuum, if you will. Like if you look at the competitiveness level of the general population, and if you look at athletes, well, of course, athletes are going to score higher, but how do they score on a relative curve to each other? We're seeing the highest performers score even higher, right? We're seeing, even when it comes to those things like ambition, scoring higher. Stress tolerance is certainly one. Sensitivity to criticism is another, right? And that these players are incredibly open to feedback, even more so than their peers who stand out statistically from the normal workplace, right? So we're seeing them, we're normalizing a professional sports curve, which is not a general sample of people out there. So we're starting to see things that you would typically see, but we're able to. That doesn't mean like, oh well, we've always been right, because you haven't been right if you haven't been able to measure it and demonstrate it and do it consistently. And we're getting to a place there now where we're looking at groups, of players who are achieving certain outcomes, beating the street on, their developmental return, and finding ways to transparently look at that and validate it. So those are a couple of the things. I mean, one of the interesting ones I always talk about with DJ is the initiative seeking of athletes. It's always an interesting one that people tend to be very surprised with, is that they don't realize that athletes generally are very low initiative seeking people from a motivational perspective. Most people see athletes, are willing to do anything and go the extra mile. Based on my research on a lot of young athletes, there's not a lot of developed intrinsic motivation to what they do. They're very responsive people, and it actually manifests very well in sport because you become coachable, and you're required to be managed. Wow. So actually, when we see athletes who are really high initiative seeking people, that's an outlier for us, and it gives us pause to consider what kind of developmental environment this athlete was going to thrive in based on their desire for control and autonomy, and deciding what's best and what's right for them, which is generally atypical, because usually we just get told what to do and go harder than anyone else will do it. We'll go farther, but generally we're not the one who decides what it is we're supposed to do first.
Is there any detriment to that? So that specific athlete who is driven, sounds like the lazy ones are the ones you want, because you can get impart some more knowledge on them. Those guys who are driven, and I see them all the time when we're out in the scouting. This guy's doing his 90 minutes before game. He's doing this, that. Is it really important, getting back to DJ's point on player development, of teaching that guy differently than the person, the athlete who needs the push? Can you just cookie cut them in one level and have them say, this is how we're going to coach them. This is our philosophy. This is what our brand is. Do you have to have multiple avenues for multiple athletes?
I think so. I mean, I have 4 kids, and I like to say they have 4 fathers. I would like to think if I ran player development, I would take great pride in knowing each of them individually in a way that would be able to communicate, relate, inspire, motivate, and regulate their behavior very uniquely, knowing that there's probably some behaviors that we would prefer to have, especially in a high performance environment. Think of just things like, what I call it like the big gamer dynamic, which is, very, very high stress tolerance and very high confidence and high competitiveness. You put those 3 things together, you tend to see someone who shows up in bigger games, right? People who like to play under pressure and under duress. Whereas if you saw the inverse of that, you saw very high, very low stress tolerance with low confidence and low competitiveness. Generally, those people would not really respond particularly well to get the best out of them under, competitive environments, right? So there are some table stakes you want to think of, right? As part of that adaptivity to the environment. How are they going to meet and regulate themselves for 20 years in this place where, it's unfair, right? And, by the way, perfect is 3 out of 10. That's kind of weird. That's just a weird wiring. If you ask me, you've got a bunch of perfectionists who think 3 out of 10 is really, really good. And clearly they've never met an engineer before or an actuarial scientist, because perfect to them is 99.9999999. But whatever, that's cool. So I think it's back to the point is that I think you need to understand and know athletes individually and have that part of your organizational approach, and have a way that, not that you can compare them to each other, but use the same lens to understand why 2 people might respond differently to a given setback or environment or instruction or outcome.
I think that's critical. And I think that's the next level that teams need to understand. The market's too small. There aren't enough players to start eliminating players. So while I might not prefer this behavioral characteristic in our organization, so long as it's not a complete red flag, the development side needs to understand how to handle that so you can maximize the player's potential.
Yeah.
It's really that simple.
Guys are and I always think back, like what you're just talking about, a Larry Bird versus Magic Johnson. Or even Derek Jeter. I was always a huge Yankees fan growing up. Derek Jeter, his ability to kind of like he could talk to the fans right before he went up versus Paul O'Neill, who was always laser focused. Don't talk to me. I was very much on my start day, like, don't talk to me. I got these 90 minutes, and for the next 3 hours, I'm gonna put in this focus. Or Michael Jordan need having even Kobe Bryant. What is the guy I'm going against? Who do I have to go against versus Magic Johnson, who could be everybody's buddy and still perform? I don't know, DJ. Like, I couldn't be like that. I needed somebody who, hey, me versus you, one-on-one, you're going to go down. I'm looking to embarrass you. I want to beat you. Always needed that outward focus. But tying it back, going to the coaching level, something that I learned when I was coaching different players, right? I was all about winning. Like, that would eat me up all night if we lost, like walk the streets type, versus the guy who he didn't do it in the same way, but he still had the same passion. So bringing that into these clubhouses when you're going to draft a team, oh, this guy doesn't care as much. Well, maybe he just cares in a different way. How do you find out? And I think what we're trying to get out of you, especially with what we're doing here in the war room, is, talking to the scouting community about, hey, how do we identify this? How do we identify that guy's not lazy? He just goes about it a different way. That guy doesn't, it's not that he doesn't care. He just cares in a different fashion than my bleeding heart does for whatever team.
Yeah. So it's always like a really important thing is like, I'm not a baseball expert. I'm not a scout, right? I very, very clearly have to delineate what I know and what I don't. And scouts are so important to understand this process and validating what we're seeing at the behavior level. How does this actually come to life? Does this make sense? Right. So there has to be a constant communication back and forth with the actual people who are observing the talent and watching as it operates in its environment and the experts on that. Right. So understanding perception versus what, like you said, might be an alternative perspective. For example, the two approaches that you talked about is that pregame routine, the guy who's laughing, joking, having fun, and the other player who's sitting in the corner focusing, right? Is one more successful than the other? I don't think so, but I imagine in a coach's perspective, one is based on their lived experience. And there's a player that they're more comfortable with, right? And then there's a tendency to try and project that onto the player or attribute certain aspects of their performance, positive or negative, to things that may or may not be related to that.
Now, that happens all the time. What you just said happens all the time in player development. And it is, you touched on it earlier, it's almost like a confirmation bias. Because he can't do this, I think it's that. Or you lean into it more heavily because of it.
The big one is the kid doesn't get it, right? That's the one that's...
You hear it all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, you hear it all the time. You hear that people don't want to talk about competitive makeup deeply because it's very, very hard to get your hands around. And then we're 6 years into the player's career and somebody says, he just didn't get it. He didn't have it.
Right.
But along the way, they don't want to dive into what it is and adjust the development plan accordingly. And as scouts, our job is to evaluate this whole thing. We had S2 cognition on. We talked about cognitive stuff. We talk about physical traits of players. Even Paul Phillips, who works for S2, acknowledged one of the buckets that he wants to jump that's really, really important is what we're talking about right here. The competitive part of the player and all of those attributes. Jay, I'm guessing you believe that the descriptors and how the player is hardwired, I'm guessing you're pretty steadfast in that you believe you have a really strong handle on what the player is and who the player is. So after you get to that part, what's the predictive part? How do we take this from a scouting standpoint and say, okay, this is what the player is. This is how we should handle him in player development. And how is there a way to connect this to some of the physical outcomes, do you think? Is that next, or is that too next level?
I think that would be really, really cool. And it is like the vision that you're trying to manifest. I think what we're really trying to do, and you bring up things like, S2 cognition, and you talk about obviously the talent makeup, is we're really just trying to assess how is this developmental pie constructed, right? How much influence do each of these factors play in an individual's ultimate development trajectory, right? And there are a lot of pieces, and there's probably pieces of the developmental pie we're not even considering. the one that I'm focusing on is that temperament component, right? That behavioral orientation side. Are there temperamental patterns that tend to be more successful in professional baseball than others? And how much of performance variance can we explain with those patterns, right? The same with cognition, with learning, right? With visual acuity, right? And then of course you have the talent assessment, which is probably the largest part, which also probably is the part, just because there's the least amount of information to miss on, is having a player as in your A bucket or your B bucket, and they're not actually an A or B talent trajectory. The behavior may be right, the cognition may be right, the vision might be right. Right. So it becomes, really humbling in that sometimes we just don't have all the information. What we're trying to do is fill in this developmental pie in the most accurate way possible, giving the right amount of weight to each variable that may contribute to this potential athlete's development.
How have teams received you? Like, how have you seen things change? I know mental health has become way more in focus, and I don't want to say in vogue, but it's more appreciated with what goes on with professional athletes across all sports, really. And I feel like golf was probably where a lot of this kind of started and trickled down to the team sports. Are you seeing more teams appreciate what you do? One, and two, is there still like, how do I validate what I'm doing? Is that something that you think about when working with guys?
Well, certainly the mental health part is a different bucket, right? I'm a firm believer that mental health care is a personal decision. It's not a club decision.
Okay.
And it shouldn't be a club decision. Do you have a psychologist at your office? No, right?
No.
And if they did, who did they work for? They don't work for you. They work for your boss, right? So there's, as a psychologist, I'm very mindful of the roles to which you play in a given athlete's experience. So the mental health part, I'm a big advocate for athlete well-being and engaging athletes and helping them develop strategies to be advocates of their own mental health and of each other's mental health. And oftentimes that comes through work at relative like players associations, working through avenues like agents and other resources that athletes have in their network that are more aligned with the personal and holistic development of the actual person, rather than just in the context of their performance work, which happens to be professional sport.
Is how much, and DJ, now we're chatting here. I think the actual player developers would really benefit from this. The idea of, hey, you're going to be working with our players. How are we going to do this? And I can think back to my experience and other experiences, but like, are those guys buying into what needs to be done? Because they have the hands-on, they're hands-on daily with what we're trying to produce here in a big league organization with our farm system, these prospects that we've given tons of money to. Hey, we should probably put a lot of emphasis on the development of our coaches. How are we teaching these things? Because the thing that I can think about from some of my experiences and just being with coaches. I mean, I was at a 8U baseball practice the other day doing some pitching lessons, and I really am adamant that most great players succeed in spite of their coaching. Two, people want you to validate what you are doing. So pitching coach with this 8-year-old, hey, can you get him to throw harder? Like in my head, no, I can't. This kid's throwing strikes. I don't have to say anything. If you can just shut up and be here and let him do his thing, stay out of his way. And I think a lot of professional organizations, you have coaches who, hey, I got to make sure they know that I'm valuable here. I got to do something versus just shut up, hold the towel, and give me a ball when I need it. Is that something like, how do we work with coaches better in developing players?
So we talked about the synergies that need to exist between player development and scouting. And this could be in curveball, like physical development, whether it's curveball development, a swing change, or whatever the case might be. But a lot of it has to do, in my estimation, with knowing the player. And one of the things that I used to believe this, and I don't believe this anymore, because I see how it manifests itself in player development. We used to say, hey, the scouts see a player here, they interview a player. By the time they get to player development's going to know that player better in 2 weeks or 3 weeks than the scouts ever knew the player. And I think to myself, why? Just because they're around him? They don't really know how that kid operates. That's where I think, I talked to someone like Jay, and it hits home, because what you're trying to do on the scouting side is really truly understand the player, hand them off to a group of people that are going to then have to bring the best out of that player. And if they don't know how that player is hardwired, the problem is it might get stuck. Might get stuck in the mud. And we all know this. We're all ex-athletes here. Players get labeled, and decisions are made about that player because we label them. And then all of a sudden they get stuck in the mud, or development veers too far off course, and the player can't recover. And then, let's be honest, professional sports is just difficult. It's hard no matter who you are. So I think it's critically important that player development utilizes this type of information when putting together these development plans, because it's highly individualized stuff.
Yeah, and I look at a player, I look at it from two lenses. Really, is important. If I'm going to do anything well with it, we're going to get anything out of it. One, I have to know what it's like to play with you. I need to know I need to be able to communicate and understand you as though we're in the clubhouse together. I need to know how you're going to respond to a 5-game slump. I need to know how you're going to respond to success, how you're going to respond to the team dynamic. That's just really, really important in developing rapport, right? And really understanding. And then I also need to see them from a little bit higher view, not quite 30,000, but 10,000 feet, and how I might be able to manage that particular individual. And that goes back to their unique competitive mindset. Like, oftentimes we become hyper-focused when we think about competitive mindset. We really just get focused on motivational factors, like the determination, the competitiveness component, like what gets them out of bed, the coping strategies, how they tolerate stress, how they tolerate feedback, setbacks, right? Those are the two primary areas where we really, tend to focus. But how does problem solving fit into competitive makeup relative to, what strategies we use here, to help teach concepts or bring things to attention, how we review things? How does a player actually construct his work day, relative to what's typical in this environment? These are all parts of the competitive makeup. And then a little bit closer to that is things like, well, what are some of the interpersonal factors we're looking at? How do they communicate and connect with people around them? Is that typical or is that atypical for our environment? And what that might mean for the types of positions we put an athlete in, or what we expect them to do in given situations. When we don't understand behavior, we hit it like this. When we understand behavior, you can go alongside anything, right? So if I actually understand what's happening, I can work with you. But if I don't understand, I'll always work against you.
The worst feeling, Jay, shooter, when you're sitting in a decision-making chair, is to feel like you have to avoid a player because it's not a good fit. Mm-hmm. That's a terrible feeling, because conversely to your point, Jay, when you feel like there's good alignment, now you're encouraged about making the selection. But in a world where there's not a lot of players to get excited about, and you're trying to find comfort in a selection, you don't ever want to feel that way, that, man, this probably isn't a good fit. This is just going to be tough. That's a bad feeling to have, because you're limiting your talent pool. So then what do the decision makers have to do? That's why I think this stuff is really important in the conversation and the connection between scouting and player development, specifically with some of this behavior stuff, is really, really critical, because it directly impacts the player's career, and it can impact it immediately. So this isn't like 3 or 4 years down the road. This can impact the career like now, and it can either derail or propel that player forward. And then the player gets labeled, and we make decisions, and very, very difficult if you can't do that. Jay, we're going forward. We've talked about descriptive, predictive. Does this have a place in amateur athletics? Does this have a place at the collegiate level? Well,
that opens up,
that's a changing world.
The holistic athlete, right? There's a lot to be gained, and a lot for an athlete in college. Especially as it relates to their academic and professional development. As I talk about, I firmly believe that the more invested you are outside your sport, the better you become at sport, right? And the more aligned your life is to fulfill all that you can become, you will fulfill your athletic potential. So there's huge value that I find in taking a step back and helping develop some of that psychological capital and identifying resources to actually enhance that self-development component for athletes. You see a lot of and not surprising, you see a lot of overinvestment, right? Especially when you get into the more elite levels of high school ball and high school sports. And we know the science is pretty conclusive that that's problematic to long-term health and well-being. It's just, athletic identity is negatively associated with mental health outcomes. Go figure, let alone transition outcomes. Like, that's wild,
Mhm.
right? Like, so, what do? We let the kids sit at home all day and do courses online at an academy program until he can choose a school specifically on whether he likes the coach or not to go play. And you still have no idea where he ends up. And, maybe he gets half a communications degree. I don't know, right? When there could be so much more potential that could enhance both trajectories in that athlete's life. I'm very passionate about that, in aligning and bringing more weight to that decision in a young athlete's life on what the professional trajectory is. Because as my lens as an athlete changed, of course I understand how an 18-year-old is only thinking about professional sports or college sports. But now, having been out of my game for a decade and seeing a world that falls way beyond that, and that lived experience moving on, as we all have, recognizing how critically important, and that I don't have to fear losing any of the qualities of my professional potential to considering whether I have a unique future in something else.
That's fascinating. The idea of a lot of college coaches like play multiple sports. And I think from one lens, it's, oh, you give your body a break, right? You're not playing baseball, so you're giving your arm a break to play basketball. You're playing hockey, you're playing football, but also it's not like you're giving your brain a break. Hey, I can get away. I'm not stuck on baseball because I have basketball season. I move on to this. I move on to that. Is that also important? Because we hear it all the time, like play multiple sports, don't specialize, don't specialize, don't specialize. Well, maybe don't specialize because your brain can't take it.
Yeah, this is a tough one for me. I've thought long and hard about this. I think that is a generational gap that I don't think we fully appreciated the runaway train of youth sports.
Mm-hmm.
That, and I call it the developmental dilemma, because you have to choose and specialize lest you be left behind. Even though it may not necessarily be the best decision for your long-term development, even in that sport, you can't continue to develop at the highest levels and have access to the highest level of resources unless you're demonstrating a proficiency in that sport at a very young age. So it's great. Yeah, you can. When I was a kid, we didn't even have ice. We all played lacrosse, right? And that's what everybody did. But now, a huge chunk of the population is out there in their sport 12 months a year. And now we're selecting teams on baseball IQ, a hockey IQ, position specific skills at 10, right? And that wasn't the case when we were kids, where you could go make a soccer team and you never played soccer. Why? Because you were an athlete and you had hand-eye coordination, right? And you could be cultivated and developed. So it represents a challenge in the world I don't think we'll be able to unpack or solve on this call, but I do feel like articulating that now we're in a position where the runaway train of youth development would be hard to stop without a fundamental shift in all sport culture and putting firm rails that we're not doing it in this time of year. I just don't think you'll be able to do that. So I look at this part that if you are going to play one sport, that you have other things that you can do concurrently, that you can find moments that can express and develop a different part of yourself, will enhance your mental health, will enhance your ability to perform, keep you fresh, and keep you resilient.
I love the idea. Like, I'm gonna write and put it on my computer here at my desk, but having something the game can't take away. I wish 15 years ago you'd been able to say that to me, and I could have put it on my glove and my hat. Like, have something the game can't take away. And at some point it will go south for you. It won't be good. What do you have that you can continue to have that, for lack of a better phrase, light at the end of the tunnel? Even when you're 0 for 4 with 4 punchies, or, like me, you just sprayed the backstop with a couple fastballs, having something that the game can't take away.
Well, that's a thing I've come across and reflected on a lot. I come across it a lot with we face it in transition. We see a lot of, and it manifests as a low self-respect, and a lot of successful people actually have low self-respect. It's an incredibly motivating factor to not be enough. And it keeps people searching and achieving a whole bunch of great things. Unfortunately, you're successful to everyone around you but yourself. And the idea behind having something the game can't take away represents that identity threat that performance ultimately plays in our life, and taking that back, right? Oftentimes I find athletes try to reflect who they are in what they do, right? I played well, therefore I am good, right? I played good, I am good. I played bad, I am bad. And it's this constant reflection exercise, but it's just a reflection. There's actually nothing holistic about it,
Hmm.
nothing that's really inside. Rather, shifting the game, that there's something in me the game can't take away. Now the game becomes an expression of who I am, right? Now I'm painting my game on a canvas, right? And I can leave that behind. I can paint poorly and it goes away and I can laugh about it, right? I'm not validating who I am with every single outing. That is a white knuckle ride that a lot of athletes are good at doing, but it ultimately comes to an end because we all lose our mirror.
I I was very much deeply involved with everything you're talking about, so this is really hitting home to me. So I won't make this all about me. This has been outstanding, though, Jay. Like I could go on, and we will probably at some point stop this interview, and I'll continue to talk to you. Sorry, everybody who's going to have to not listen off where. But DJ, do you have anything else for Jay? Because I know we're stealing a lot of time here.
This was fantastic, Jay. We really appreciate your time. I hope we can circle back at some point, maybe dive into some maybe some more specific things down the road. But unless you have anything else for us, for our guests, this has been absolutely fantastic. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Love it. I appreciate you guys. Appreciate the education that you guys give me as well. You guys are awesome. Love the work you do, the platform. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share my experience. And if it's helpful to someone out there, then it was definitely time well spent.
Thanks a lot,
Thank
Jay.
you, Jay.
DJ, I'm blown away. Jay Harrison, outstanding. Really, struck a nerve with me. Some stuff that I went through in my playing days, of the mental aspect of the game, how to get away from things, but the assessment of these players. I kept coming back to and being stuck on how do we get player development better in line to help foster these prospects into blossoming into something better.
Yeah, I thought that was really, really good. To your point on player development, these guys have a tough job, and we've brought this up a couple different times. We're in the business of evaluating the players, ranking the players, and such. So we're diving into S2, and we're diving into Blast, and we're diving into this makeup stuff, and all these different things. Player development has a very, very difficult job. They're being pulled in multiple directions. They're getting pressure from the outside with independent facilities. They're getting pressured from the very top of the front office that's being run most of the time by analytic guys. So what are they to do? The hard part for them, Shooter, is to take this information and to really, truly utilize it. But they need to. They absolutely need to, because these players that are coming in aren't all wired the same. And they need to be instructed differently. So they need to use this information when they start to craft their development plan and to message.
Yeah.
And to message to the player. One player does not need to hear the same thing that another player hears. I think we know that. We should know that.
It's the cookie cutter approach is just gone. It can't happen anymore. I am adamant, and even when I was coaching, about the private facilities, just the hands-on ability. I think most coaches, players, especially the college level, will tell you just how much impact a strength coordinator has. They spend more time with the player than anybody. So being in touch with, hey, what is the player doing? What is he expecting? This is his pitching coach. They've built up a rapport. He has trust in this. You may lose trust in an instant if you try to take away what this kid's been told for 8 years. Hey, guess what? You just drafted, you paid me a lot of money, and now you're going to tell me I'm wrong? Like, you can get lost, bud.
You just absolutely nailed it. I think that before Jay came on, we were talking about the role of the scout. And we touched on this a little bit with Jay, but what is the role of the scout in 2024 and beyond? Understanding what's the development curve of that player is really, really important. And then if you have somebody that understands how that player is hardwired, now you've got you're armed with some really good information. How disappointing is it if you have that information? The scout knows the development curve, the expert knows how the player's hardwired, then you hand them off to player development and they just do what they want to do. That's like that doesn't make any sense to me. I've heard this said to me before. Oh, we're going to go buy all the groceries. We're going to spend the time figuring out where the best grocery stores are to shop. I'm going to bring you a prime steak and then you're going to put it in the microwave. How does that make any sense? So I think player development really needs to take the information. Well, let me start with scouting departments. They need to spend the time to make this behavior stuff really, really important. They need to understand the development curve that the player has gone through. And when they hand it off to player development, there needs to be a concerted effort to adjust that player's plan accordingly. It does no good if you bring in a player that is highly intelligent, that knows himself better than you. He might be more educated on pitching than you are.
Mm.
And now he might not have your experience. He might not have pitched in the big leagues yet, but he's highly in tune with his body. He understands the numbers. And then you're going to just completely throw a curveball at him and say, oh, we're going to do it this way. We need to change this. We need to change that. After you just unloaded $3, $4, $5 million on the player, how does that make any sense? That's going to be very difficult for the player to swallow.
The amount of scouting department blames player development blames scouting department, and we all just rest on the back of our first rounders war. An outliers massive war. We all just, hey, you know what? Let's skew the numbers. We'll average all this because this guy has an infinity war and it makes us all look bad.
Yeah, I don't, this is about the player. We keep saying it here at Prep Baseball. Mm-hmm. I saw it last night when I was out at the Tennessee PBR that Hunter was putting on. We had 100 really good players, 27s, 26s on the field. This is about elevating the player. But somehow we're going to bring them into player development at the professional level. We're going to call it individualized. And then we're just going to live by our own narratives because we're not willing to take all the information that the scouts have found. We go ahead.
I was going to shift gears more specifically for me, like what Jay was talking about, getting away. And again, I'll say it's something the game can't take away. Having something that the game can't take away. Having
That's
something
right.
that you walk into Lake Point and go 0 for 4, you can go to the pool and still have a good day. You didn't have a good pitching performance at the future games in front of 300 college scouts. Can you get away and come back next time? Mm-hmm. Is there something else you can do? And I think for any big prospects listening, there is importance to being able to get away from the field. You have a long summer, having to be at the stadium from 10 to midnight every day, have one day off. And when things aren't going well, losing that focus of like, life is still good. We can move on to here. I think that was utterly important. And the fact that Jay flat out said those guys perform better. So in doing that, if you are investing way too much time, now there is a bell curve happy medium, right? You do have to be good enough, right? You do have to put in the work necessary, but going and putting in work just for work's sake is what I kind of took away to that can be detrimental. Sometimes it is good to go play video games, to go mini golfing, to go go-karts, to go paintballing, whatever it may be, go play hoops like I love to do. I think there's tons of importance in that versus, and tying it to the scouting aspect of like, all this guy does is baseball. He's locked in. I could just picture sitting at a table for you like that. This guy eats, sleeps, breathes it. Well, that might be a red flag for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's your identity. That's the hard part here is we all love baseball. That's why we're doing this. That's why the player the young 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old player continues to play the game. They want to play it at the highest level, but to play it at the highest level, there has to be a way to decompress. For those of us that had a hard time with that, you understand it. You absolutely, I can feel it in my scouting career, let alone my baseball career. You have to find ways to disengage from something that you love and identify with something else because it will overwhelm you. It's too difficult. It's absolutely too difficult. I think you touched on the multi-sport athlete thing, and whether you're actually playing, that might be unrealistic in 2024, but whether you're playing another sport or you're finding things that you can invest in outside of playing the game of baseball, outside of playing the game of hockey, whatever it might be, are really, really critical. And we heard it. The guy played in the NHL for 9 years. He battled with these things. Now he studies them and he understands them.
Yeah.
He referenced that. He referenced the performance in Australia, I believe it was, or New Zealand rugby,
Yep.
and how they studied players who were invested in other things in their career. Super for young players to understand that. Really, really important.
And you know what? For young scouts to understand that is important. I at least from my standpoint, as a scout, I probably care about baseball more than most of the players that I watch. The really good ones probably have something else that they're doing. Right?
That's
They
right.
may be trying to make a clothing line. They're over here. Some are, what Jay was saying, some guys are starting hedge funds, whatever it may be, that are daily stock traders. And that can be difficult as a scout to watch a player not care as much as I do about this game.
Bingo. Absolutely. And that's not a bad thing. I use that example of a player that I watched that the comment was made from a family member. I just wish he liked baseball like he likes football.
Wow.
I mean, as a scout, that's just, as a scout that cares and a scout that's invested in this, it's hard to hear that. But maybe that parent was telling you everything you needed to know. The game's not everything for my son. And that's a good thing, because it doesn't mean he doesn't compete. It doesn't mean he doesn't work, but he has another avenue to release when baseball inevitably, like it always does, it doesn't go well all the time. It's a game of failure, especially in baseball. It's a game of adversity, and you need to have that release. I think that's one of the main things that we heard from Jay. That's a big attribute of players outside of you can have determination, motivation, work ethic, all of these kind of things he addressed, but you have to have a release.
Yes.
Have to have a release.
Well, it was an outstanding show. I'm grateful that Jay was on. I think we're going to have him on again. Just even afterwards, we talked for, another half hour and could have gone on just like with Jim Callis for a while. But I'm looking forward. We got some big stuff coming up for the War Room. I'm especially looking forward to getting on the hot seat and having DJ Svihlik, former scouting director, grill me like I'm at the MLB Draft Combine, trying to get some intel on the prospects. So DJ, looking forward to the next one. Shooter Hunt, DJ Svihlik. This has been the War Room, Prep Baseball, Draft HQ. We'll see you next time.